has been in contact with Central Asia ever since the Aryan invasion of the country. This contact was further strengthened during the rule of the Guptas. In our last discussion, we talked about the relations between India and Central Asia, and especially the significance of trade in cementing cultural contacts between India and Central Asia. Today, we shall focus on religion as an important carrier of culture from India to Central Asia, and also examine the effects of these cultural contacts. We have with us here Professor Taupati Sengupta and Professor Srila Roy. Now ma'am, how far was religion and other aspects important in the transmission of culture from India to Central Asia?
Religion was a very important vehicle, was a very important medium through which Indian culture could be disseminated to Central Asia. And we have seen that both trade and religion really went hand in hand in this dissemination of culture. Now, religious link with Central Asia, however, can be traced back to the time of Ashoka the great Mauryan emperor. If you recall, Ashoka had sent numerous Buddhist missionaries all over the world, different parts of the world, to Sri Lanka, Ceylon, and to China, to Burma, and also to Central Asia, right? So India's religious link with Central Asia really is said to have started, can be said to have started from the time of Emperor Ashoka. Now, this gathered further momentum under Kanishka the great Kushana emperor, and who himself was a great patron of Buddhism and who also sent a Buddhist missionary to Central Asia. And the climactic point was probably seen under the Gupta rulers, the Gupta emperors. And this process, however, did not stop with the Guptas, however, and it continued even later on. And our main sources for the study of religious link between Central Asia and India, or Buddhist activities in Central Asia, can be gleaned from two very important Chinese scholars, the Chinese travelers. Of course, I mean Fa Hien, who visited India during the reign of Chandragupta II, Vikramaditya, and Huan Sang, who of course came after the Gupta period was over, nevertheless saw the net result, the net effect of what had been going on in the previous centuries. So we more or less rely on their accounts. They are the earliest sources of our information. Now, talking of Fa Hien, he writes that after he left China, the first kingdom that he visited in Central Asia was the kingdom of Shenzhen. And here at Shenzhen, Fa Hien came across a large number of monasteries, Buddhist monasteries, nearly 4,000 in number. And Fa Hien's observations in these monasteries at Shenzhen very forcibly illustrate the vital presence of Indian culture at this period all over Central Asia. And he writes, I shall quote a little from exactly what Fa Hien writes. He writes that common people of this and other kingdoms, as well as the monks, practice the rules of India. We do not, of course, know what he meant by the rules of India, but this is the exact translation of what he wrote. And further, he writes that the monks whom he met in these monasteries and whom he saw at these monasteries were all students of Indian books and Indian language. Now, this is a very important source of information. Not only was Buddhism spreading as a religion, but side by side with the spread of Buddhism, we also see the fostering of Indian language. So you see, language was also becoming Indian language, that is Sanskrit, Prakrit, very few Prakrit words, because Sanskrit was often mixed with Prakrit in the manuscripts. So all this was also being taken to Central Asia. So Sanskrit was also leaving its own soil and migrating, so to say, to another part of the world. So not just when religion does not leave, but when religion travels to a new country, it also takes with it other paraphernalia, right? Language, script, etc., etc. So you see, these cultural components automatically accompany religious spread. Huensang, who visited India in the early 7th century during the reign of Harshavardhan, now also corroborates that Buddhism was in a very flourishing condition. Right, and he also says that Indian scripts were known and Indian books were used very much by the Buddhist monks, and there were several hundred monasteries. Fahin had already mentioned 4,000 monasteries. Huensang mentions several hundred monasteries were in Kashgar. He says there were several hundred monasteries in Kashgar, and Khotan in the south and Kucha or Kuchi in the north were two very powerful centers of Indian culture in the Tanim Basin and the valley of the Upper Sindhu. And especially he mentions that in Khotan, he talks about Khotan and he says that the royal family followed Buddhism. Right, and not only the royal family, but a vast majority of the subject people, a vast majority of the population were Buddhists, and there were 4 very great monasteries, very important monasteries, and these monasteries were all, in fact these 4 and other monasteries all over Central Asia were all endowed by local rich people, local rulers, sometimes people holding very high ranks in the society, that is the moneyed people, and also the merchants. So here the traders and the merchants were also playing a very important role in fostering Buddhism, in fostering growth of religion, because they were now moneyed people and they appeared as sponsors. That is a modern term to use. They were sponsoring the establishment of Buddhist monasteries, so to say. And where were the merchants sponsoring these monasteries? In the oases. The oases in the desert areas, which were gradually evolving into trading towns. Right, because of the existence of the long silk route where the caravans would stop, the oases were gaining a very important economic significance during this time, and the merchants and the traders played a very important role, and very often they also contributed towards the building of stupas and monasteries. So this is how the role of the traders can be seen in the context of spread of religion, spread of Buddhism. And numerous monasteries were there, of course, and what is significant is that Huensang also mentions that there were many convents for nuns. So here we get an idea that how, yes, Buddhist nuns were also becoming important in Central Asia, and the nuns lived mostly in the northern part at Kucha or Kuchi in and the nuns also played an important part in religious life of the people. And there is ample evidence again of adoption of Indian scripts and the use of Indian languages, which must have also greatly assisted the traveling Indian merchants. So you see, the merchants were also benefiting from this, because with the result of the growth of Buddhism in Central Asia, there was a need for learning Indian language. There was a need for learning Buddha's language if they wanted to read Buddha's teachings in original, right? And this in turn also helped the merchants. So you see, the interests of the merchants who were traveling to Central Asia also had a great need for coming into of spreading in their own language, because they also needed a common language with which they could communicate, right? So all this was really linked up, I think. To some extent, there was some kind of Indian colonization, and I think in that context it is a very pertinent question. I can mention the name of a very famous Buddhist philosopher of the time, whose name was Kumarajiva. Kumarajiva was a Buddhist philosopher, and he lived at Kucha in the 4th century AD. and his father had married into a very noble family of high rank, and they had settled down there. So Kumarojiva, I think, will be the most suitable example here, right? And he decided to stay back. So this is one instance of colonization that we find, right? Yes. A Buddhist scholar staying there. Again, I can give you another example, like much later, during the time of Yuan Sang, there was this great Turkish king, the Great Khan. He was called the Great Khan, the Turkish chieftain. He somehow became very interested in Buddhism, in Buddhist doctrine, and he pleaded Yuan Sang to stay back and teach him something about Buddha's tenets, Buddha's principles. But Yuan Sang could not spend so much time. But once he came to India, he sent back a teacher from Nalanda. His name was Vidya-mitra, and he went to Central Asia, and he became a great teacher of this great Khan, the Turkish chieftain, and we can say that in this way Buddhism also made some impact on the Turkish people. This is very surprising, right? So the Turks also came under the influence of Buddhism to some extent, and Vidya-mitra was therefore another person who lived there, right? Now, there was also a great linguistic similarity we find between India and Kucha. Kucha was a very important area, as you must be realizing by now. Kucha is situated in the north. It is pronounced both as Kucha and as Kuchi, which is why I'm constantly referring to Kucha or Kuchi. And in Kuchi, the people of Kuchi spoke a particular language which belonged to the Indo-European group of languages. And they spoke languages like Kuchian or Takharian or Arsi, etc. Right? So there was a lot of linguistic similarity also. So the question may very well arise, where did this language originate from? Was it a broken version of Indian language, of any Indian language? So there was this very close link, close connection between Indian language and Kuchian language. So that is an area where I think research can be carried out, and that is an interesting subject to talk about. We find that a lot of Indian influence was felt on music, right? And this is what Yuan Sang writes, and he says that a few Indian musicians, again in the area of Kucha or Kuchi, which seems to have been a very culturally advanced area, right? And here there were a few skilled musicians. They were very much skilled in playing the lute and the pipe. And Yuan Sang says that they followed the Indian music system, right? So there was a lot of Indian influence on that, and there is no doubt that Kuchian music owed much to Indian influence. So music is another area which affected not just religious men, monks and nuns, but common people, the lute players, the flutists, right? People who come from the ordinary walks of life. Now, another important and interesting information that we gather is that in fact the Chinese annals refer to the existence of a Brahmanical family called Sao. So this family lived again in Kucha, and they were hereditary musicians. So here was a Brahmanical family devoted to music. They were hereditary musicians. I think this is a very important piece of information, and they were very much under the influence of Indian music. Now, besides music, other arts and sciences of India also flourished here. Now, for example, a manuscript was discovered, the Bower manuscript. It was discovered by a person called Bower, and hence it obviously it came to be known as a Bower manuscript. Again, it was discovered near Kucha, and this Bower manuscript contains 7 texts, of which 3 are on medical treatises, right, on medicine.
That's very interesting.
And the manuscript belongs to the Gupta period, right? It has been found that it belongs to the Gupta period and is written in Sanskrit. It is written in Sanskrit, again mixed with many Prakrit words. So this is a highly interesting discovery, the discovery of the Bower manuscript in Kucha, which deals with medical treatises, medicine, and is written in Indian Sanskrit and Prakrit. So you see, Sanskrit was not just a literary language, even Indian science was using Sanskrit as its linguistic vehicle, right? So Sanskrit, we tend to equate Sanskrit only with literature, literary texts.
In a way, in Sanskrit became the lingua franca in the Gupta period.
It became the
lingua franca of the Gupta period. In the Nalanda monastery also they were using Sanskrit.
Right.
And in a way we can say that this monastery you are talking about, in a small way they are emulating the Nalanda, the model of the Nalanda or Taxila University.
Right. So, you know, this is what was happening, and this is very interesting to note. So Sanskrit was becoming, as you said, it was the lingua franca, it was the official language, and it was already being transported to Central Asia. So what language is the most important vehicle of culture, isn't it? So if language can be understood, you can understand the people, you can understand the culture. Balkh, which was a very important area, Balkh or Bactriana, Bactriana, to the south of Oxus, was also a very great center of Buddhism. Now, interestingly enough, its capital, the capital of Balkh, was called Little Rajagriha. Now, that is an obvious allusion to the great Rajagriha of the Magadhan Empire, right? And it had 100 monasteries, it had 3,000 monks. And Huan Sang found here relics of Buddha. And he found relics of Buddha and old sanctuaries. And it also had a convent where nuns lived. And it had a Sanskrit name. It was called Nava Sangharama. Sangha, you know, Buddhist Sangha, Nava Sangharama, and it was a very renowned Buddhist institution. And Huan Sang also saw that Buddhism flourished at Ghazni also. Ghazni, right. The place we associate with Mahmud of Ghazni, right? There also peace was taught. Probably there was a course on peace studies. Non-violence was taught, right? So Ghazni, and at various places between Balkh and Badakhshan. So this is what Huan Sang found. And the rulers of these two places, this is more interesting, and the rulers of these two places were said to have descended from the Shakyas of Kapilavastu.
Very interesting.
That is very interesting. And however, very significantly enough, Brahmanism also existed. Huan Sang also mentions that Brahmanism also existed in some of these places, and especially at Antalopo. Antalopo and or Andarab. Now, Huan Sang further mentions that he found fire worshippers in the land between Oxus and Jaxartes. So this is all that he found here. And so Buddhism therefore must have made great strides during the Gupta period, and side by side with the growth of Buddhism, with the spread of Buddhism, we find that Indian languages also found a niche in different regions of Central Asia. It aided the traders in turn, the merchants and the traders also in their own way contributed towards the growth
and it broke the barriers in communication.
Broke the barriers of communication. So both the traders, both trade and religion, I think, were equally important in linking these two countries, India and Central Asia.
What were the net effects of these contacts with Central Asia?
Well, the effects, the consequences of this contact, which was a very long contact, it had to be very great and very intense. And especially, Shreya, when you remember that the number of people who moved, who didn't move from India to Central Asia, from Central Asia to India? There were, of course, there were the missionaries, the monks, the merchants, we know about them, the diplomats were there, the musicians were there, the magicians were there, the jesters were there, the mahout would travel with his elephant. So all kinds of people were on the move, and as a result of this was going to have a tremendous cultural impact. To start with dresses, okay? language and dress, lifestyles, habits. We can start with the dresses. If you look at the Gupta coins, you will be surprised to find that these Gupta kings in the beginning, kings like Chandragupta, Samudragupta, they are all wearing foreign clothes, Central Asian clothes. You know, maybe these clothes were available ready-made in India or they were made, but later on it is very strange that they are changing over to their Indian clothes. What could be this, the significance of this? Perhaps after they have vanquished the Shakas, they did not want to wear the clothes of their fallen enemies, and we find that there was a kind of Indianization. Well, this is in one aspect that we find the change, and there are many others, but the very important change that we see was in the field of sculpture and architecture. All of us know about the great influence of the Gandhara art, the kind of tradition which was initiated by the Kushans. They made path-breaking experiments when they were deifying the Buddha, first time transforming the Buddha legends into images. And in Mathura also a part of this Kushana art had flourished, but you know, it was under the Guptas. The finest expression of the Buddha in the human form, that was to be found under the inspiration of the Guptas. The great evolution which has taken place in the realm of art in the Gupta period, that was definitely inspired by the Gandhara art, but it became very much indigenous in its form and content both. And also the freestanding temples. Previously we had the rock cut temples in India, but as a result of the influence of the Central Asian monarchs or the Central Asian models, we see that freestanding temples were coming up. Not that much of the Gupta temples remain, but what remains from that, we can say that Central Asian influence was in concept, or at least in idea, it was it owed very much to its Central Asian traditions. And with the temple of Deoghar, the Deoghar temple, which is a stone temple, or the Bhitargaon temple, which is a brick temple. These are the two freestanding temples which we have come from the Gupta period, and for this the Central Asian tradition perhaps has got some points to explain. And in administration, in polity, there was great influence of the Central Asian experience. If you remember,
the satrap concept.
The satrap concept was there. Prior to that, if you remember that at the time of the Mauryas, last time before these Central Asian kings, when we have indigenous kings of India ruling in the country as emperors, Ashok, he called himself as the beloved of the gods, the Devanampiya. But we find that Devanampiya becomes Parameshwara, Parama and the Bhagavata in the Gupta period, in the Allahabad inscription of Samudragupta, as you remember. So the king as a representative of God on earth, the divine right kingship, the divine right claim that was being made in the Gupta period was definitely influenced by the Central Asian or even the Roman ideas.
How do you explain that the divine right theory of monarchy really came from Central Asia?
Because,
is there any concrete
because
example?
You see, Kanishka himself called Parama Daivata. Parama, king, great king, king of kings,
right,
son of God. Okay,
right.
These are the things, these are the kind of epithets that they were.
Oh, right. Kanishka had brought this idea along with him from Central
which
Asia.
Which he inherited from his Roman predecessors, or the Roman emperors who had ruled in India, ruled in Central Asia. Even in China also, the king was also some sort of a deified form of God. Okay, so we find through all this context,
so the divine right theory was imported
from Central Asia to India, and we find definitely there was technological advances because of the Central Asian contact. Astronomical Javana Jataka we have mentioned earlier, astronomical advances
Medical
via the
treatises
Greeks and the
also.
Romans, which came to Central Asia and which was inherited and sort of accultured by the Indians. So that way mathematics made great strides in the Gupta period, and it could not have done so much unless there was this contact with the Western world via Central Asia. The other very important thing is that the growth of martial arts, Jiu-Jitsu as it was known. Martial arts, you know, it went via India. It became gradually what we come to know about judo from Japan. But you know, this martial arts, as you disable the enemy by not physically harming him, you disempowered the enemy without causing any physical injury, physical harm. This was what was taught by the monks in this region, because you know, as I told you, that the terrain was very inhospitable. There were different kinds of people moving constantly, displaced people constantly looking for new homes, and you know, a person or either his person or his wares, his property had to be protected against any kind of attacks like this. So we find that the martial arts became a very developed form of art in Central Asia, and it had gone from India. India got it back again from Central Asia after a very long period of time.
So we can conclude that no culture can really grow in isolation, and that positive connectivity is very important for mutual enrichment. And I can't help but quote Romila Thapar, who writes, "It could be said that India, both because of its geographical position and because of its economic enterprise, participated effectively in what was probably viewed in those times as almost a global trade of the early first millennium."